Amdi au ze pahwai pautski te pashtu shagirpan os ze bingamtan ki osijon au pa el delta pa Elmira ki ze de hukumati au haiwan di shagirpan. I can deliver that very short greeting, tell you my name, my background, and what I study here at Elmira with near certainty that even if the audience were extended to include all of those currently living in Elmira, there's a very good chance that no one would understand what I was saying, could respond to me, could identify the language, or even if told what the language was, as Ryan has informed you it was Pashto, could tell me where that language was spoken. And even though we have been engaged for nearly a decade in what last year became America's longest-running conflict in the nation where it is spoken fluently. And so, before I begin to suggest alternatives to specific foreign and military policies, I want to point out to you what I believe to be the most critical change necessary in our current approach to the conflict in Afghanistan. Clearly, I'm not speaking simply about the ability to speak Pashto or Dari fluently, but rather what the alarming lack of those capable of it here in the United States, or even knowledgeable of their existence, should reveal to us about the mindset with which the American public, and in fact our policymakers as a whole, approach Afghanistan and the Afghan people. Throughout the remainder of my short presentation, I would ask that each of you please consider introspectively the degree to which you have sought knowledge and information about the culture, customs, religion, the sociology as a whole of the Afghan people and their nation. For many, the answer to that question is going to be not nearly enough. But for some here present, it would perhaps be, Frank, I've looked as hard as I possibly can for the information that you're suggesting I look for, and I can't come up with any more. And again, I would ask you to consider what this void of available information regarding a people and place which are clearly so critically important to our nation's international policy reveals about the attitude which we in the United States and much of the Western world now hold concerning nations like Afghanistan. It's clear that our current and future policy leaders, presently under the headship of President Barack Obama, face one of what is the simultaneously most critical and yet most difficult decisions in modern history. And yet the overwhelming majority of those in policy-making positions throughout the military and Congress know little more than the average United States citizen about the crucial historical and sociological factors which dominate the Afghan theater. This is incredibly sad to me, not only because it guarantees that little would be done to improve the situation in Afghanistan, to the detriment of innocent Afghans and our brave men and women in uniform, but also simply because Afghanistan deserves a chance to rebuild itself. The Afghanistan of a generation ago, as described to me by those who experienced it firsthand, was a beautiful and burgeoning region which had played host to civilizations millennia old. Long before the arrival of Islam, around the year 4000 BC, independent monotheistic religion had built up around the city of Baghti, which is now Balkh, in northern Afghanistan. From this civilization, they developed a 12-month calendar, and the Nowruz, or Nui Khal, literally New Year festival, was born. One Pashtun, a man who recalls with sadness having been forced to flee the country during Soviet occupation of the country, reminisced to me about his days as a child attending, as part of the Nui Khal celebration, the Mela Kuli Serk, or literally the Red Flower Festival, in Mazar-e Sharif, a time when, as he described, the ground would seemingly become blanketed in red tulips in every direction for as far as he could see. He would laugh and smile to us in describing the kites, the picnics, the food, and the soccer games. But I heard this man recall stories like this one on multiple occasions, and each and every time he was eventually reduced to tears. Now, though once a slowly modernizing and culturally diverse nation, far separated from the sorts of theocratic Islamic fundamentalism that Saudi Arabia has long espoused throughout Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, Afghanistan is little more than a crumbling shell of its former self. In their book, Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould described this tragedy, writing, and I'm quoting here, "Today's Afghanistan is a neo-feudal, corporatized playground of international greed, warlords, NATO troops, private military companies, and radicalized Islamists. Kabul's traffic-congested streets are a vision from hell, where chatter-clad women beg desperately for handouts at the darkened windows of local drug lords' Japanese SUVs. For thousands of years, a hub for trade and a melting pot of culture, Afghanistan is now the world's largest exporter of heroin, a culture of unbridled exploitation, and the most radical and extreme forms of Islam." Well, this passage, clearly colored for effect, the picture it paints is disturbingly accurate. Without understanding where the country has been, who its people are, and why it became a war zone in the first place, how do policymakers across the Western world expect to do anything but exacerbate an already tragic situation with decisions which are uninformed, short-sighted, and misguided? And yet, despite my overtly critical attitude toward the current policy in place for Afghanistan, I do believe that the tide can be turned, and I believe that we in the United States, that the United States as an entity, is the organization, the key to enabling that shift. But the most important step in initializing this process, aside from treating Afghanistan more like a nation of people and less like a political or military science project, is to, quite simply put, get out of the way. Every day that we ignore our country's foundation as a nation of liberty by arrogantly acting as seemingly interventionalist as we possibly can, we not only lessen the chances for Afghan victory over extremism, but erode the very moral fabric of our own nation. Afghanistan and Afghans must be allowed, as their basic liberties afford them, the opportunity to rebuild their nation in a way which they deem necessary. This will require that the policymakers in Washington start making decisions with solutions which are best suited for Afghanistan and not necessarily which are best for them. This, again, will mean that these men and women will need to educate themselves and their staff in a way which equips them to make these decisions intelligently. Our elected officials and senior military leadership have either forgotten or chosen to ignore the lessons of the past, lessons which both Britain and the Soviet Union are intimately familiar. Despite our best intentions, no matter our resolve in Afghanistan to see it free of radical Islam, we will always be seen as an occupying force by the people of Afghanistan, a reality which turns otherwise moderate and progressive Pashtuns into ISI-trained, Saudi-funded, anti-American Islamic terrorists. We only do our cause harm when we exercise ignorance in our pursuit of victory against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And let us not forget that these are our targets in this conflict. We are not at war against Afghanistan, and we must begin, if not again, then for the very first time, to act that way as a nation. President Obama and our military leadership must reassert their commitment to the preservation of human life, placing it first amongst their priorities in Afghanistan. In other words, stop killing Afghans. We must begin by attacking the disease of violent fundamentalism at its roots in Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, not using the tools and tactics of conventional warfare like B-52s and Hellfire-equipped Predator drones and fighter jets. This hyper-violent and clearly disproportionate use of force on rurally situated mud-walled huts seems almost cartoon-like to the observer, but the reality is something much uglier. The number of Afghan civilians which have been killed as a result of coalition attacks has risen each year since 2001. The great majority of these deaths are the result of unplanned airstrikes and an inconsistent application of the rules of engagement. If we fail to see how this connects us to the nation's past, the Afghan people certainly do not. They remember the days of British bombing raids and the devastation brought on by the Soviets' use of MiGs and the much-feared Mi-24 Hind helicopter, an act for which By the way, we led the way in calling Russia calling the Soviet Union criminals for utilizing. Instead of fighting this conflict in the homes of innocent Afghans, trace the problem to its source. This seems painfully commonsensical to me. If one finds a trail of ants marching across their kitchen floor, they don't simply stomp out the insects they can see, because of course the ants will soon return. They follow the parade back to its source and get rid of the problem for good. In this way, we must trace the problem of Islamic fundamentalism, its training and its funding, back to its genesis in Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. I ask all of you now, is it not confusing that while not a single Afghan, or even more specifically a Pashtun, was found amongst the planners and perpetrators of the 9/11 attack, we still traced it back to and fight it now inside Afghanistan? How then did Afghanistan come to play host to violent radical Islamists? The larger story here is one which I hope you will invest some time in educating yourself. But to put it quite simply, we put it there. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in the 70s, radical Saudi youth saw an opportunity to carry out their version of jihad, literally struggle, which they had come to believe was best served through violence and martyrdom. A story which one Pashtun Afghan tells me is that while they were fighting as part of the Mujahideen inside Afghanistan during the Soviet occupation of the country, they fought clearly as Afghans for Afghanistan, for a free Afghanistan, for what they remembered Afghanistan to be. In his case, however, one day they're sitting in the back of a pickup truck, a Toyota pickup truck, which is driving across the southern Afghanistan, and suddenly, strangely, in the middle of a bombed-out field, they see a man chained to the roots, essentially what's left of the stump of a tree standing there in the middle of this field. And they drive up to investigate, assuming that it's someone who's chained a Soviet soldier to the tree after having executed them, and find alive and well a Saudi Arabian youth, probably of no more than my age, 25 years old, strapped to the tree. And upon questioning them, they find out that he had a friend chain him purposely to this tree, so that in case he were tempted through his sin to run away, he could not. And he was specifically standing there chained to this tree in the hopes that the tree to which he was chained would be mortared, and he would be martyred and killed. This is the sort of mentality which has now infested Afghanistan and which pervades in this creation of a new Islamic fundamentalism. If you combine that radical mentality with millions of dollars in covert CIA operations which trained and armed the Afghan Mujahideen, or holy warriors literally, to beat back the Soviets just as they had the British in the decades prior, years after the establishment of the Taliban government in primarily tribal areas of Afghanistan, the same radical element literally controlled a nation. Funding from sources like Osama bin Laden and his father's booming Saudi construction company ensured that the ideology was securely positioned in a seeming safe haven for extremist ideology. In a sense, exiled from Saudi Arabia, who sought to protect their oil-based relationship with the West, these Islamic extremists saw the U.S. troop presence in their homeland and the royal family's refusal to eject them as the work of infidels. Already, the United States had become a blasphemous occupying power on Islamic soil and immediately became the next target of the entity which the West had itself created. The time has come to deconstruct this organization just as we inadvertently established it. This process is one detailed enough that it could serve as the subject of several additional presentations. In short, however, it should consist of the following basic principles. In the same way that we would draw down our true presence in Afghanistan, we should seek to do so in any theater of operation where they are so clearly no longer required. Alternatives to our staging areas in Saudi Arabia do exist, and the United States should begin to seriously consider whether it might not be more strategically sound to begin that sort of transition or to even eliminate what is quite possibly a fabricated need for such a location in the first place. Secondly, we should continue to pursue alternatives to fossil fuels, and in the meantime, explore the possibility of supplying those fuels domestically or in cooperation with Canada. Eliminate the need for foreign oil dependence, and we eliminate a system of inadvertent funding of Islamic terror, which is decades old. Additionally, we should work with the Pakistani government to discover the sources and reasoning behind the ISI. The ISI, by the way, is the Pakistani government's, their military's, officially run intelligence service. And we should begin to discover the sources and reasoning behind their funding and training of terrorists. Our fear of individual nuclear arms arriving in the hands of the imams has long paralyzed us in our dealings with the Pakistani military. But this is an absolutely necessary step. It may be very, very difficult. That I will submit. But it is extremely necessary in order to secure Afghanistan and stem the flow of radical extremists. Beyond the military approach, however, we must also concentrate on helping Afghans in a way which they can see and appreciate for themselves. As I mentioned earlier, success must be defined by the needs of the local people, not by those of Washington. The way in which humanitarian aid is now funded and delivered seems like it is literally designed to fail. Contractors inside Afghanistan are not held accountable for their actions, and it is not unheard of for funding to trade hands 4, even 5 times, with each exchange skimming off a portion of the aid, so that when or if it finally arrives, it is only a small portion of what was expected and intended, angering both those who supply it, who fund the projects, in other words, the American taxpayers, and those for whom the aid was intended. We must help Afghans clean up their government and establish local infrastructure backed by initiatives which require the participation of the populace in order to succeed. An example of this, of course, is schools which are established in a community, but only under the understanding that the community itself first establish a plan for maintaining and defending such a school. In this regard, Afghanistan could use a core of American civilian expert retirees whose knowledge can help to purge corruption and establish real government. Military action, even victory, is completely meaningless without the proper government establishment to back it up. Post-Soviet development of the Taliban should have taught us that lesson. Above all, respect the innate value of the Afghan people as a fellow human being. The Afghans, Pashtuns in particular, though I'll admit I'm a bit biased, are a beautiful, proud, funny, clever, and intelligent people with an enormous amount to offer the world community. Think of them this way, and then begin to consider what can be done to help them rebuild their wonderful country. Among the first steps which must be taken on an individual level, Afghanistan must once again discover a way for each family to feed themselves and earn an income. As part of the long-running war on drugs, a war which has accomplished nothing and is widely recognized as having failed miserably, the United States and coalition forces continue to destroy poppy crops across Afghanistan. The policy is terribly flawed conceptually and ignores the need of the Afghan farmer. Without the necessary roads or security with which to deliver agricultural goods to market, the selling and growth of poppy crop is a matter of life and death for the average farmer. When he is provided with no alternative and his crops are sprayed with pesticide which sicken his family and kill his livestock, it is easy to see why, once again, the average Afghan becomes a convert of Saudi extremism. Solutions which explore the legal use of this poppy for the creation of morphine should immediately be brought to the table. The country of Afghanistan, and in fact the world at large, is constantly in need of morphine tablets and medications built from opium. Organizations like LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, could be approached for assistance in establishing the sorts of program which could make this option a viable one. Finally, as I wrap up my presentation, I'd like to address my fellow students directly and I think that's best done without a script. The lessons that I have learned about Afghanistan, the passion that I have for Afghanistan, is one which I developed as a result of seeing it firsthand. I experienced the people, I spoke their language with them, and this connected me to them in a way that it's very difficult to engender in other people without them having experienced the same thing along with you. But I implore you, please develop the same sort of passion about learning about these civilizations, whether it be Afghanistan in our current conflict or any other civilization which we might be engaged with either now or in the future. I ask very, very sincerely, very heartfeltly, please, please, make it your priority, your first priority in dealing with these sorts of situations, to actually engage yourself in the people. Make yourself aware of their culture. Learn the language. Learn the customs. Before you can make value judgments about a people and about how our country should interact with them, you must understand them fundamentally. That is our country's problem now in approaching Afghanistan the way that we do. We do not take into consideration the Afghan people. We view it as, and if you read my article in the paper a few weeks ago, we view Afghanistan now as a faceless conception of what we believe the Middle East to be. Many can't even tell you where Afghanistan is on a map if it's placed in front of them. How many of you in this room knew what Pashto was before I explained it to you? And don't feel badly if you didn't, because that is the norm across our population in any situation with something like Afghanistan and Pakistan. So again, please, please, please become involved in a way that challenges yourself to learn more about the people. And before I finish up, I'd also say, don't fool yourself into believing that you're not important. A lot of the time I think that that's why we don't challenge ourselves in that way. We don't believe that we are actually that missing piece of the puzzle. And in very many cases, you are, or you could be. Many people don't even know that the puzzle is there to solve. You establish for yourself who you are in regards to the rest of life circumstances. I had a conversation with Ryan just this last week about how I suddenly realized as we were sitting there that in less than a decade I qualified, though it would be unprecedented, I submit, I qualified to run for the President of the United States, and that in less than 5 years I could be a senator, and that right now I could be a congressman. That's incredible. We don't consider those things. Who's to say that we can't be those things? With that, I think I'll finish it up and open up for questions.